You don't know, you damn well should know. My name is Rag Reynolds, and today I'm responding to another video from Marina Shut Up. And I must say, before I get into this, I had a quick glance over most of it before I started, and it's certainly one of the better videos she's made. I don't agree with what she's saying, obviously that's why I'm making this response video, but I think she comes off very well in this video. She is respectful, she displays her opinions well. So I'm going to try and be as respectful as I can, just to be fair back to her.
My question is, how do people who make videos and wear glasses record without their lights reflecting off of the lenses? Because the answer to that question eludes me.
Well, what I would suggest is either take off the glasses, because you don't really need to read anything or see anything if you're just rambling like you say you are at the end of this video. You say it's unscripted, so that shouldn't matter. Or you could just, buy other glasses with no lenses in them, or clear lenses or something. Pop out the lenses, something like that, and then you've not got that issue.
So today I wanted to talk about stuff. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Sounds good to me.
So what I want to talk about today is the dictionary definition of feminism. Should we use it? Should we not use it? Is it adequate? Let's discuss.
Okay, so before Marina gets into her thing and I start responding to her, I just want to make my opinion on this clear before I start. So, any of my audience who have watched me for any amount of time will know that I am not a feminist. I don't agree with feminism. You'd probably call me an anti-feminist. As far as the definition thing goes, there are a couple of definitions going around. You display one in your video later. The most known one to me was I always like to, I just Google such and such definition. So I Google feminism definition. And Google supplies me a definition using the Oxford Dictionary. And it's the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of equality of the sexes. Obviously this means that feminism is about getting women the same rights as men so that they're equal. That is what it means. However, when you display it later from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's a bit different and it's more general, just equality. The first example has absolutely nothing to do with men. So if you're using that example, you're not talking about equality between men and women. You're just talking about women getting the same rights as men, which we're going to disagree with, Marina, but they do already have in the majority of the Western world. In the US and the UK, women have the same, actually they have more rights than men do. Using your definition, that's something I can get more behind because it is for equality, but again, I still don't think it's necessarily needed when you've got stuff such as egalitarianism, which means the advocacy of rights for all people. It's not just men and women, it's not just the sexes, it's for gays, it's for straights, it's for blacks, it's for whites, it's for everyone, not just one or two groups of people. So I think egalitarianism is a far better thing to get behind. Regardless, take out definitions from this. I think the problem here is when you have a movement such as feminism. Feminism is a movement. It's not just a term, it's not just a label. Feminism is a movement of people. And when you have a movement, the definition, it obviously evolves, it changes. When feminism first existed, it was an extremely noble cause. That's where the definition I was going by from Google comes from, and it's the original definition of feminism, and it's about these women coming together to become empowered and get those same rights as men, and it was a good thing. And there are all these people such as Christina Hoff Sommers is a perfect example of a classic feminist who goes by that, and you get what I'm saying. So obviously the definitions evolve with time and evolve with whatever the movement is doing. And my problem with feminism is modern feminism. I have no problem with the feminism of old. My problem is with the feminism of now. I do not think that what they're fighting for, what feminists are fighting for, is necessary. I do not think that what they're fighting for is needed. They talk about a wage gap. Meanwhile, if you think there's a wage gap, you're either uneducated on what the issue actually is, or you're just being dishonest. The wage gap, okay, it exists, but it's not due to inequality. It's a misrepresentation of statistics. It's simply just earnings versus wages. Women take more holidays than men. They choose to work part-time more often. They are less likely to go into dangerous jobs, and dangerous jobs are the more high-paying jobs. That's why something like 96% of all workplace deaths are men. It's because they take the more dangerous jobs. And it just really infuriates me when people say that women only make 77 cents on the dollar, because it's simply not true. And any serious economist who actually knows what they're talking about doesn't take the wage gap seriously. It's just not a thing that is taken seriously, because it's not true that women are earning less for the same jobs. And there are actually some areas now in the world where women are actually earning more than men for the same job. Certain states in America, women are earning more than their male counterparts. So these are the type of things that I'm against feminism because feminism spreads these lies. Even though they've been debunked a million times, feminists and feminism will continue to spread them.
As someone who discusses feminism, social justice, the like on the internet, I often run into conversations with people who don't necessarily share the same ideological leanings as I do. But I find that a lot of problems that arise when I am talking to someone who is politically opposite or, just shares a differing opinion with me is that we're using different definitions for the same word.
And that is why dictionaries exist. Dictionaries are there so that people have a common understanding of a word. Obviously, it gets a bit confusing when there's two different dictionaries with different definitions of feminism. They're close, the definitions, it's just one's obviously leaving out that men are also part of what feminists are fighting for. But that's a part of the problem. I think that dictionaries are important, and it is important to kind of pay attention to what the definition is. But dictionaries also do need to evolve. They need to evolve with the times. If a movement changes, the dictionary should be changing as well. But the dictionary is important, and everyone should kind of have a general consensus on what a word means by looking in a dictionary. And that's why we have them in the first place.
And this comes up a lot, for example, in discussions of racism, where we're using two different definitions of the word racism. They're using the dictionary definition of racism, which usually is along the lines of being prejudiced or discriminating against someone based solely on race. Where I use a sociological definition that I personally find to be a lot more in depth. It usually takes into consideration power dynamics and the legal history of race and the way that race has been classified and societal systems and things like that.
Now, I 100% disagree with you here, but I'm very, very grateful for this. This is the first time that I personally have come across someone who has said why my understanding of racism isn't correct. I appreciate that you're explaining. You just think it's too simplistic, and you think that the sociological definition fits it far better and it explains it more. No one's ever tried to explain that. Anytime I've had a conversation with someone such as yourself, and I've said racism is about you can be it's simply being prejudiced due to race, and they've said no, it's about power structures and all this other stuff. And I've said, but the definition is this. And they're saying, no, it's not, it's this. But you are the first person I have personally heard actually explain why. And although I disagree 100% with what you're saying, I can understand it, and I appreciate what you're trying to say.
So it's not just isolating racism to be a person-to-person encounter where, anyone can be equally discriminated against based on race.
Well, you see, Marina, this is where you're wrong, because anyone can be discriminated against based on race. And just the same way as well. I'm going to give you an example now. Imagine you've got a highly successful CEO of a corporation, and he's a black man. Now, a white man is going for a job, and he's going to an interview with this black CEO. So he goes in, he sits down, he has the interview. Everything's going perfect. He's the best candidate by far the black man has ever seen that's applied. And then the black man turns around and says, "You were great, but I am not hiring you because you're white." That, Marina, is racism, and it's being discriminated against because this man is white. He is not getting this job simply because he is white. And that is discrimination based on race. Now, if you flip the roles, and a white person was doing it to the black man, and they said, "You cannot have this job because you are black," it's the same thing. It's discrimination based on race. Now, you would obviously argue about power structures, and white people tend to be in power, and although we may disagree there, what you still need to acknowledge, though, is the fact that in this scenario, this black man is in a position of power. He's in a position of power. It's not always a white person in a position of power. Black people can be in positions of power over white people. And this is an example of that. It is an example of racism that can work either way. And there are many more examples like this that I could give you. But my point is, discrimination, take out the word racism, but you can be discriminated against based on your race, regardless of what that race is. And it can happen to you of equal magnitude, regardless of your race. So, what is racism? If it's discrimination based on race, then that's racism.
So that's an example where I think that the basic Merriam-Webster dictionary definition is not the most useful in certain conversations, because it's always going to be very simplified. It's going to be like 1 to 2 sentences max, and it can't possibly get into the core of the issue, because that's not really what it's meant to do.
Well, yes, of course, you're right 100% here. Dictionaries are not supposed to go into the inner workings and details of a definition. But that's exactly it. Definitions are only supposed to be short. They're not supposed to be complex. And what you're doing is you're making words such as racism and you're making words such as feminism far more complex than they need to be. It doesn't need to be that complex. The words just mean one thing. That's what it means. And obviously you're going to have variations from that. Not everyone's going to be the exact same. It's like you'll have a Christian. Christian, by definition, is someone who practices the teachings of Jesus Christ or something like that. But there are various different ways that people practice those different teachings of Christ. Some of them are hardcore Christians who think that being gay is a sin. Other people don't care and they just go to church on Sunday. Some people don't even go to church on a Sunday and they still identify as Christian. So I think it's the same with feminism, and you're obviously going to have a bunch of people who identify with this definition, but it doesn't mean that the definition has to be any more complex, because as soon as you start making this definition more complex, using a sociological definition like you're doing with the racism, is it expels so many people who were already identifying from that definition. And I also think that it makes things much more confusing than they have to be, especially if something has been known to be something else for so long, and then suddenly you come along and you're like, well, it doesn't mean this anymore, it actually means this. So it's a hard thing for people to change. If you're identifying as a feminist from age of 10 till 50, that's 40 years you're identifying as a feminist, and suddenly someone tells you it no longer means what it meant when you were 10 years old, and it means something completely different. It's going to be hard for that person to accept that. Being a feminist has been part of their identity their entire life. Now, that's a completely different thing, and I don't agree with wrapping your identity up with labels like this, but people do it. And going by trying to introduce longer, more complex sociological definitions doesn't help anything. What we need is new words. Instead of trying to change old words or make things confusing, you come out with a new word. So we're talking about racism. So racism in general is just, prejudice based on race. That is what racism currently is, although you may argue. But what we should have, to fit your definition of racism, is we have a different term for it. So instead of calling it racism, maybe we are going to call it power imbalance racism. Or you know what I'm trying to say? That's a terrible example of what of a word or term to use, but you know what I mean. We need to find a different term to use, even if it just means adding a word in front of it, because at least then we can differentiate between what I'm talking about and what you're talking about, because there's no point in saying, oh, I'm talking about the sociological definition and you're talking about the dictionary definition. There's no point in doing that, because it becomes such a technicality and so minute, and it confuses matters. Instead, we need two different terms.
And I will admit that I have been a person in the past who, when I've been having conversations with anti-feminists or people who just don't necessarily identify or agree with every aspect of feminism, I've said the dictionary definition of feminism is someone who fights for equality. So if you're not a feminist, then you must not believe in gender equality. Which, looking back, I realize is not the most helpful argument to make, and in the end, neither person has come to a better understanding or has really been swayed either way.
You are 100% right there, and honestly, I fully respect you saying that and admitting that, because I feel the exact same way. It just feels like you're running around in circles when you're arguing with someone over a simple definition.
I'm not sure if I find the dictionary definition of feminism as someone fighting for social, political, and economic equality as being specific enough. I don't know if I find it super useful, because pretty much any person ever is going to say that they're for equality, but we could have very different ideas of how to achieve equality, and we could disagree. We could be on completely different sides of the political spectrum and, say that we're for equality.
Well, you see, I think you're holding too much onto that meaning of feminism, because it doesn't simply mean, if you're for equality, just go by the definition. Let's say that definition is 100% accurate, and that feminism means you're fighting for equality between men and women. Well, you're not a feminist just because you believe in equality. You'd be a feminist if you were actively fighting for equality. That's the difference. So if you were an activist, if you were protesting, that would be what made you a feminist. Labels like this are things that you can't just put a label on someone and say, oh, you believe in equality? Well, you're a feminist. I've seen people do that before, and you can't just do that. Labels are things that people often choose. If you want to be labeled as a Christian or an atheist, then you choose that as what your label is, and it should be the same with feminism. I mean, you could believe in God, but it doesn't mean you're a Christian. You might not believe in the Christian God at all. You just might believe that there is some sort of God there, maybe not the Christian God or whatever. And it's the same with feminism. Saying that you're for equality, sure, you agree with maybe what feminists are trying to fight for, but feminism itself isn't about just equality. It's about the methods. It's about the facts that they're trying to put forward, the narrative they're pushing. That is what feminism is. They've got certain core beliefs that aren't as simple as equality between men and women. I think it's also important to note as well that just because you're a feminist, it doesn't mean you have to be on the same side of the political spectrum. There are feminists who are Republicans and there are feminists who are Democrats. And if you're just going by feminism being fighting for women's rights or fighting for the equality of the sexes, it doesn't matter. You're fighting for the same thing. It doesn't matter what. No, when you're part of a movement, you don't all need to have the exact same viewpoint on every single issue. You could have the exact same viewpoint on abortion, but you could have completely different viewpoints when it comes to childcare and custody and stuff like that. So I don't think it's necessarily saying much to say that you could be on the opposite side of the political spectrum.
So I feel like using a broad definition like that might be helpful to an extent, but I don't know if I personally find it useful anymore the way that I might have found it useful in the past. I think it might be more helpful to use more specific definitions and more specific terms when we're having conversations like this, because a lot of the time I might agree with someone, but the way that we're using definitions leads to fundamental disagreement and confusion and miscommunication, because we're trying to articulate the same idea, but we're doing it in completely different ways.
See, I don't think it's always that you're trying to articulate the same ideas. I think, the general idea, of course, is the same. Everyone, every reasonable and rational and good person, I should say, wants equality between men and women. The differences occur when feminists tend to think that there is a problem where a problem isn't. It's not so that it's not really often that there are different solutions, although that sometimes is the case, but a lot of the time it's not to do with the solutions, and it's to do with people thinking that there's a problem when perhaps there isn't. And as earlier I explained in this video, for example, is the wage gap. Now, if feminists go out saying we want equal pay, they're never. What are they fighting for? More pay? They're going to be overpaid. It's going to tip the scales because they already have equal pay. They're going to be tipping the scales, and now they're going to be the ones earning more money on the dollar in comparison to men, and it's going to be that will create an inequality. So stuff like that needs to be changed. Stuff like rape culture. Rape culture is nonsense, and we might completely disagree with that, and it's far too complex of a topic to discuss in this video, but it's another thing. If one group of people aren't willing to admit that something exists or don't think that something exists, and another are adamant that it does, regardless of what they say, then you're never going to even if you have different solutions, there's not going to be two different solutions because the other group doesn't think there needs to be one, and that's where a large part of the problem comes in. But yes, as we did say, the solutions can often be different on each side. An example of that was, although there's no rape culture, I would say, there's certainly a problem with people being raped. Rape is a horrible thing and it shouldn't happen. Any number of people being raped is far too much. But the idea that feminists say we need to give people consent classes and stuff like this, I think that's a ridiculous solution. So my solution is nothing to do with that. My solution would be more like reform to the way that maybe rape's reporting or handled and dealt with and looked into. I mean, you still can't just assume guilty until proven innocent. That's not right. But we should have maybe some sort of reform into the way it's all dealt with, since we do know that so many people, there are definitely... It's a hard crime to prove. That's what I'm trying to say. It's hard to prove that you were raped. So sometimes it's hard and people just have to take the victim side almost. But that's not right either, because you can't just assume guilty. It has to be innocent till proven guilty. So there's an example of something where we'd have different solutions. So it is solutions, but it's also... you have to acknowledge that sometimes they just...
And then the conversation just doesn't go anywhere because so much time is spent saying, well, what do you mean when you say the word racism or sexism? And what do you mean when you use this word? And then it becomes all about defining things instead of like actually communicating ideas. And I find it frustrating, but I also don't necessarily know if I have a solution to this problem. I think maybe it's just important to be precise in our language and hold ourselves to a higher standard when we're using words with very specific meanings.
Well, you say you don't have a solution, but I think I do. And what my solution would be is to stop focusing so much on labels. Stop going on and saying, I'm a feminist. And then suddenly you're in a debate of, what actually is a feminist? Don't say, I'm a social justice warrior. And then people argue, what is a social justice warrior? Stop saying, I'm alt-right. And then people saying, what actually is all right? And they're arguing over that. It deflates and it distracts from the issues. So what I think people need to do is stop getting hung up on labels. Labels ruin everything. Instead of saying, I'm a feminist, and what you think a feminist is, obviously, is someone who's fighting for the equality of the sexes and you believe in certain things. So what you would say is, instead of saying, I'm a feminist, you just say, I believe in equality. I believe in women and men should have equal rights, equal opportunities, etc. And instead of hanging on to a label that everyone has a different idea of. I think it would be much better to be judged on individual ideas rather than your labels. Labels also lead to judgment, so much prejudice and judgment, and you can't help it a lot of the time. If you've got a bad experience with feminists or whatever, and then someone introduces themselves to you and says, "Hi, I'm a feminist, and I'm this and I'm that," and sometimes you might get a bad impression. Same with anti-feminists, and I try not to label myself as like an anti-feminist as much as I can. That's why earlier I said some people might call me that, but I try not to call myself that. I try not to give myself too many labels, because when you do that, people are very quick to rush to a conclusion and judge you. And you end up arguing over those labels rather than the issues. And I think we can both agree that that's not in anyone's best interest. So maybe that's something to think about. We maybe should abandon labels.
And I know I'm not perfect with this, but I think it's just something that I've been thinking about a lot. And it's something that I want to keep in mind more when I have discussions in the future.
Okay, well, I think we've gotten through most of what you have to say. And I want to just, before I say anything else, just want to thank you for making this video. I've responded to some of your other videos, Marina, and I've really not been a fan of them. I didn't like the way you came across them, whatever. I didn't have very much respect for you. This video has made me respect you in a way. I respect this video entirely. I think you've changed drastically in a lot of the things you're saying from previous videos. I might still disagree, but your deliverance and stuff like that, you just come across a lot better, in my opinion. And I've actually really enjoyed making this response. This is my longest response video on my channel to date, and it's because I've really enjoyed being able to bounce my own thoughts and ideas off of you. So I really do appreciate you making this video. And I'd also like to say, if you were ever interested, I would happily have some sort of discussion or debate on either my channel, I've got a podcast called On The Rag, or on your channel. I really don't mind. I would love to have some sort of live discussion with you on YouTube about whatever ideas or topics you would like to discuss, and I will be sure to reach out to you after I've uploaded this video in some other way to see if I can get a response from you. It would be very much so the same sort of style as this video was. I think I was quite respectful throughout this video. I can often be quite sarcastic and snarky and maybe a bit bitchy in a lot of my other videos, but in this one I've refrained from doing that, and if we did have some sort of discussion, this is also how I would be addressing things. So if you're ever interested in that, please just let me know, and I will jump at that opportunity. And for everyone else, until next time, you're welcome, society.